Hey there, and welcome back to the Dr. Brooke Scheller Show. I'm Dr. Brooke Scheller. I'm thrilled you're here with me today, and I'm going to be covering a topic that I originally planned to talk about last week. However, the dietary guidelines still hadn't been released for 2025 through 2030. So today I'm going to spend a bit of time breaking down the new dietary guidelines, especially as it relates to the alcohol recommendations, because I want you all to know more about what our government is recommending for our alcohol consumption and where they're missing the mark. Now in 2020, the dietary guidelines were released on December 29th, 2020. And so I assumed that this year they would also be coming in quite late, but I didn't anticipate that it would be January before we saw them released. The reason why I'm talking about this topic with you today is because I have been eagerly awaiting to see the new recommendations for alcohol consumption. And I want to share with you my thoughts on the new guidelines that were just released last week. Now, see, the new dietary guidelines are getting a lot of positive attention around the shift toward more whole foods. And they released a new pyramid, an upside down version of the old pyramid. If you're a Stranger Things fan like I am, I didn't think that we would end up in the upside down, but here we are anyway. And the big thing about this, the big focus is really around protein. And we're already starting to see this come into play in some of our restaurants and some of our marketing, this big push around protein. There was also this kind of mention of ending the war on protein, which many people are commenting about how there is no war on protein. We've added protein to virtually everything we could add it to. It's added to water, it's added to coffee, it's added to just about anything that you can imagine. But really, the biggest focus is that shift toward more whole proteins, more full-fat dairy, and veggies really at the top of the pyramid. Now, even though the visual has changed, many people are thinking that these are big shifts in the dietary guidelines. And actually, these recommendations were all basically being made, but now we're acting like we recreated the wheel. It's a kind of simplified version, which is definitely a good thing, but it leaves out a lot of the nuance that the public and the experts still need in order to make recommendations. Now, they also make a comparison back to the old food pyramid from 1992, which was actually eliminated and replaced in 2011 by MyPlate. MyPlate was really seen as a new way to look at how we should be eating, and really has gained or garnered a lot of attention for being a really easy to understand and digestible, no pun intended, visual. So the storyline they're sharing isn't exactly correct. The old food pyramid was eliminated about 15 years ago, and now we're acting like this is a brand new change to the dietary guidelines. But of course, my biggest focus is on the alcohol guidance. In fact, over the last few months, there has been a ton of discussion around what the new dietary guidelines will say about alcohol. The new guidelines from the 2025 through 2030 dietary guidelines for Americans are consume less alcohol for better overall health. There's also a sentiment that says people who should completely avoid alcohol include pregnant women, people who are recovering from alcohol use disorder, or are unable to control the amount of alcohol they drink, and people taking medications with medical conditions that interact with alcohol. For those with a family history of alcoholism, be mindful of alcohol consumption and associated addictive behaviors. And that's it. This document kept it really vague, really broad. And what's missing from the previous guidance is they've removed that 1 or 2 drinks per day definition of moderate drinking. Even though there's been a lot of arguments in the industry around is that 1 or 2 drinks per day healthy or not, the removal of it opens up a really interesting discussion, because it now creates more vagueness and more guessing that people have to do. They used to mention in the dietary guidelines what constitutes itself as a drink. 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, 1.5 ounces of liquor. And that was, again, a way to help people understand how much one drink really means. And the other thing that's really important to note is all of the alcohol and cancer language including that alcohol influences risk of cancer, increases risk of death, liver disease, cardiovascular disease, injuries, and alcohol use disorder, all removed. Very interestingly, Big Alcohol states that this is, of course, a big win for them. I think where it looks like progress is part of how they tend to make things look good for the public. It's how we tend to make things seem like we're making progress even without making much progress. See, the problem is big alcohol industry is now suffering in sales significantly, and they're really looking for ways to detract from a lot of the communication and the conversation around the health effects of alcohol. So some of you might look at this as progress, but really it is going back to what the guidelines were like in the 80s. You may have seen the press conference with Dr. Oz where he says, don't drink it for breakfast. He calls it a social lubricant that helps us connect with others, and that being an important aspect of health. And this is exactly what they want us to believe. They want us to believe that we need alcohol in order to socialize, to interact with others, to relax and experience relief. But really, alcohol is driving a lot of these chronic health conditions. Now, alcohol was added to the dietary guidelines in 1980. It was updated in 1990 to include the definitions of moderate drinking, the 1 or 2 drinks per day, depending on if you're male or female, and only small updates since. So things like the connection with cancer and some of these other health effects have been slowly added in throughout the years. However, we've basically gone back to 1980. We've stripped away all of those additions for the sake of vagueness, and this vagueness works in their favor. But here's the problem. Years 2022 through 2025 were critical years in research on alcohol. So we've virtually gone back to the 80s version of alcohol guidance, knowing full well that the research has grown substantially. You might remember in January of 2025, the US Surgeon General released a new statement or advisory on alcohol and cancer. And this was really looked at as progress. We looked at this as being a big deal. We were making a more public discussion about the links between alcohol and cancer. And one thing I found really interesting about that report is that it stated that only 45% of Americans knew about the link between alcohol and cancer. And when I speak about this to groups, I usually say that we have a lot of work to do in telling others about the links between alcohol and cancer. And we really thought that this was going to give us a move in the right direction, that we might see these dietary guidelines start to move more toward less drinking. Now, one of the controversies about the alcohol guidance is that they disregarded a major report that was intended to inform these new guidelines and opted for a more favorable report published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And this is because they basically said that Congress didn't appropriate the funds and that we're only going to use this one study to inform our alcohol guidelines. Well, conveniently, the disregarded report, which was completed in 2025, pushed far too much into the harms of alcohol. It's talking more about the 200 different health conditions that alcohol is linked to. Yes, 200. And the conclusion that even small amounts of alcohol poses health risks. This is much more in alignment with the current research. And toward the end of 2025, the government agencies decided that since we didn't pay for it, we're not going to use it, it's biased, etc. There was a whole article about this in the New York Times. I did some reporting on it, and it was a really, really interesting discussion because you can go online and see this full study and read this full report, but it no longer was being used to inform the dietary guidelines. So what should the guidelines be? Is there a way that we can speak more about the truth of alcohol and the harms that it is placing on us and still be respectful of the public interests as well? Well, one really interesting thing is I was hopeful that we would follow suit with Canada. In 2022, Canada released new guidance that really changed things from the 1 or 2 drinks per day to a system that looks at it per week. So they started to recognize that low risk begins 1 or 2 drinks per week, not per day. And those health risks increase between 3 and 6 drinks per week, and anything 7 or more drinks puts you into a category which can potentially influence your health. It's not to say that this is the only opportunity the US government has to release guidance. They can release something separate, and I really, really hope to see that happen. But really, when it comes to Canada, they took a big stand against what those previous recommendations were. So if I was on the council, if you were to ask me, where do I think we should go? I love those Canadian guidelines. I think it shifts from the drinks per day to the drinks per week. I think it really helps people understand that they can't just have 7 drinks in one day, and that is the same risk as having 1 per day. It moves really from the idea that you can save it up and drink them on the weekend, because we have seen in the studies and in the research that this shows more harm than just having that 1 drink per day across the board. So here's what my 2026 alcohol recommendations are. For no risk to health, you're going to drink 0 alcohol. For a mild risk to health, up to 1 drink per day, but only up to 3 drinks per week. So yes, you could have 3 drinks throughout the week, not saving them up to have 3 in one occasion. Your moderate risk to health is going to be introduced at 1 drink per day and 4 to 7 drinks per week. A high risk to health is coming from 1 or 2 drinks per day and between 7 and 14 drinks per week. And very high risk to health is anything 3 or more drinks per day and 15 or more drinks per week. Now, for some of you, that might sound like a lot. Back in my days of drinking, I was far exceeding those high-risk guidelines. And as a reminder, alcohol is a class 1 carcinogen, meaning it is known to cause cancer in humans. And part of the reason why we feel silly when we drink is because it's poisoning our nervous system. The World Health Organization says that the risk to health begins at the first drop of alcohol, and that the less you drink, the safer it is. And this is from their 2023 announcement that no level of alcohol is safe. I believe we are doing a huge disservice to the public by not sharing more about this, not providing them with more support and information around alcohol. We argue that there is a chronic disease crisis in this country, but we're overlooking the fact that alcohol consumption peaked during COVID, and alcohol is linked to many different health conditions. I really believe it's one of the main things that we're overlooking as it relates to our health and wellness and chronic disease. But we're addicted. We love drinking it. Alcohol has virtually drowned our society in the idea that we need it to connect us to others and that the harms really aren't that bad. Now, meanwhile, there is a huge movement toward alcohol-free living, sober curious communities, and people generally looking to cut back on their drinking for health's sake. I'd love to know what you think about the new guidelines in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more in-depth analysis of alcohol and how to recover. And if you have a history of drinking, it's okay, me too. I do a lot of work now to try to repair the long-term damages and the effects of how alcohol may have influenced health. So check out the show notes below to learn more about my programs for healing.